Hi, everyone, and welcome to our very first conversation on future and faith. We are here with Peter Rollins, of course, who you're here to listen to today, Spencer Burke, and then we have on the Zoom conversation as well, Barry Taylor, and I'm Maria French, and we are with the Hatchery LA. And we are hosting these conversations on future and faith to ask some really vital questions of how we move our faith engagement forward into the 21st century in ways that are not only theologically engaging and sound, but also sustainable into the future. So, Pete, thank you so much for allowing us to be here today and having this conversation with you. You have just had an amazing body of work, an amazing career talking about what it looks like to engage notions of God into the future in ways that are made meaningful and significant.
That's very well said, Lyle. I want to write that down. Can you say that one more time? Everybody else thinks that.
We're all fans. We're all fans. Before we get started in some of kind of the meat of this discussion, can you just tell us a little bit about what you do and why you do it, or them, I should say.
Okay. My name is Pete. I guess I started off doing community development. So I started off with a group called Icon, which created what we call transformance art and decentering practices. So transformance art is kind of like performance art, but designed to help us change the way we desire, the way we interact with the world. And then decentering practices were designed to kind of like throw us off course, get us to question things that we might not otherwise question, see things in a different way, but to enjoy that process, because often we're terrified of decentering, often we're terrified of asking questions of our deeply held beliefs. So I ran that community for about 11 years. And then I moved to America, and primarily I've been spending my time writing, speaking about those issues, and also helping people who are practitioners, people on the ground, bring some of those ideas into their communities.
Yeah, so you talk about decentering practices and bringing these ideas. Why the decentering? Why the need for decentering?
Yeah, I mean, funnily enough, decentering is a very productive thing. So when we think about in the history of the West, Copernicus was a decentering cosmologically, where the Earth was seen as no longer the center. Darwin was a decentering of the way we understood humans. Freud was a decentering, the idea that we think consciousness, we're in control of our lives when there's lots of unconscious drives and desires that are at work. So I noticed that decentering is actually a very productive force. And in the same way, I wanted to develop spiritual practices that kind of like mimic that, in the same way that kind of introduced us to doubts, complexity, and ambiguity, not as an end in itself, but so as to generate new ideas, new growth, new possibilities, new horizons, new futures. So that's what a decentering practice is trying to do.
Yeah. So again, the need for the decentering practice. What are you observing about the pulse of culture and the philosophical landscapes, the theological landscapes, the religious landscapes in the West that are emerging, that are challenging some of these traditional notions that you are trying to introduce?
Yeah.
Like, what are the trends you're seeing? Where are the shifts happening?
Yeah. I mean, I'm less optimistic in some ways than some people. Some people think that there's a shift away from the need for, say, certainty, more embrace of doubt and unknowing, and that we maybe as a society are able to tarry with our doubts and our struggles a bit more. I would say that's not the case. I would say we're just finding new ways of avoiding a confrontation with the other, a confrontation with things that challenge us. The issue is people don't believe the church can offer wholeness and completeness anymore. I mean, less and less people believe that.
Yeah.
But more and more people think that, having enough money, having fame, having enough possessions, having enough money, that will do it. So for me, it's like human beings, we're always trying to avoid decentering. We're always trying to avoid confronting our own demons, our own darkness, our own shadow. And there'll always be people selling snake oil, and there'll always be people selling certainty. There'll always be people selling satisfaction. And my work is about saying that wherever that's happening, in its sacred or secular guise, we have to challenge it. And for me, that's what religionless Christianity is.
Yeah. Barry, you're such a helpful voice in this conversation for a few reasons. One, you and Pete go way back as friends, but as colleagues and partners in this work. Coming from a cultural and a theologically progressive standpoint, what are some things that you would contribute to this conversation in terms of how you and Pete have worked some stuff out?
Well, I think where we both resonate, particularly on the heels of what Pete just said, is, there's an awful lot of stuff out there in the world right now that's essentially, it all seems so great because it's all designed to help people be happier and help people, well-being and to be calm and to meditate and all that stuff. And I'm not sort of denying the intrinsic value of some of those things, but what's happening is people are doing all of those things, but nobody's really addressing the reasons why we have anxiety or concerns or doubts. We're just getting prepared to go back into the same environment. And I think where I've sort of tracked a lot with Pete and really appreciated the things that he's brought to the table is that he's sort of not only kind of named those things, so whether it's doubt or uncertainty or stuff like that, but then the challenge is not to try and find a cure for that as much as to learn to live in that and with that, and not to see it as an overwhelming negativity, but as a pathway to finding a life that has a sort of resonance and a richness. So I think, would you say that's fair, Pete?
Absolutely. And just to echo it, I was talking about this earlier with the group that I'm working with today, that I've noticed there's like a proliferation of mattress adverts, like all these how to get a good night's sleep, right? And so you ask yourself, well, why is that? And one of the reasons is probably because more and more people have trouble sleeping. And so the answer is better mattress. And the worry is that meditation works. The worry is that drugs work, i.e., we are living in an increasingly anxiety-producing age. And what we try to do is find ways to momentarily get rid of the anxiety through a better mattress, through certain drugs, certain meditation. And maybe it works a little bit. But what it does is it works to give you momentary respite. So you re-enter the frenetic, crazy, chaotic world that you live in.
Yeah.
You're interested in doing is going, how can you change your world in such a way that you don't need a very fancy mattress, right? Because you're not so anxious that you're having trouble sleeping. And a lot of the spiritual and secular remedies that we're seeing today are designed to not transform the worlds that we inhabit, but to allow us to be able to not go crazy. And I think that's the wrong way to go about it. So
Yeah. I mean, there's that, and we've talked about this, that there's that really interesting book by Jonathan Clary, 24/7, which sort of argues that the goal of capitalism is essentially to get everybody 24 hours a day. So, the military invents drugs that keep soldiers awake for days on end. The whole sort of capitalist drive is to, you can sleep when you die. It all sounds so gung-ho, and it's amazing to me how much Christianity's picked up on that, 24/7 for Jesus.
You know that some companies now, but also integrate sleep into the work pattern.
Yeah.
So even though sleep itself becomes commodified,
yeah,
you can go for a nap and then you feel refreshed. But what's that doing is it's even commodifying the one place.
Well, it's also it's like the tech companies with their basketball courts and ping pong tables. It's it's great. Yeah, take a break and go play ping pong, but you're still at work.
Yeah, they've colonized not only the workspace but also the space that's outside. That's Foucault's issue about resistance.
Yeah.
Power defines both power and its resistance.
Yeah.
So make certain laws and make certain things outlawed. So you control both the law and the resistance. Anyway, sorry. Just
well, but so I think so I think where the important move comes in the future is addressing these, like the opportunity is to address these things from another angle, which I think would be the sort of radical theology move, which is to sort of not accept the conventional response of the church or the society necessarily in how these things might be addressed in a way that's fruitful for people. And that's not to dismiss everything. You know, there's value in being able to play ping pong at work or take a nap. So I'm not going to sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I do think the system generates a way of living that creates the very thing people are trying to get away from. And the remedies are actually in the same cycle. And I think you see the same thing acted out in Christianity. It's just got different language, which is why I think for a lot of people, they find their experience of religion kind of stressful. You know, it's like, oh yeah, it's all about grace, but suddenly you're weighed down with a whole bunch of expectancies and guilt and shame about things that somehow you're supposed to be doing now. And I think, again, without getting too brown nosy, what I like about Pete's work is the way that he wants to confront those through a number of avenues. So through a sort of multidisciplinary perspective, you know, theological, philosophical, psychoanalytical, and bring together a whole bunch of ideas to break open so that we can see a bit more clearly what's going on, and then find ways to act differently. I don't know if that makes sense.
This is actually one of my critiques of progressive Christianity. Is, for me, progressive Christianity wants to get everybody in. So everybody can, so take for example, gay marriage, right? It's like, you know, straight people have been able to get married, so now, you know, gay people are able to get married. So it's, in other words, if certain people were allowed into this institution and now some other people are allowed into the institution, so why shouldn't everybody be as unhappy as us? Let them get married too, right? But the idea is perhaps communities that have been excluded from the way we do marriage actually have better ways of understanding how to do relationships. And instead of getting everybody in, the idea is to look to the people here on the outside and go, can you teach us the problem with inside itself? So instead of trying
Maybe
to get
everybody wants to get out instead of getting in.
that's the Pauline Universal. For me, the Pauline Universal is not that we get everybody in, but is that we get everybody out. that the inside is really crap, right? The inside of where everybody should have the right to work for Google or whatever and have a job. I'm like, no, it's terrible. No, there's other ways of constructing society, and it's the people who are on the outside of our system who have been forced, who have seen the badness of our system because they've been excluded from it, have potentially created more interesting ways of doing life together. So if we want to learn how to do life together, we look to the margins. And so that's key for me for radical theology. And just in light of that, there's one other thing I wanted to say, in light of what you were saying, but I've kind of forgotten. So we'll
try and jog your memory. So you
I was just going to say, sorry, I didn't mean to jump on you. I was just going to say it's very interesting that you could argue that when Jesus said to the Pharisees, it's not what you take in, but what comes out that defiles you, that's precisely the point you just made. But instead of making it the narrow moralizing thing that generally is done, you could see that as actually a kind of more symbolic statement about the very thing you just addressed.
Well, and I can't help myself.
There's your radical theology sermon for the weekend.
I can't help but enter a Nick Cave lyric in here. It just seems so appropriate. God is in the House, a song from his latest album. It's his latest album, isn't it? that God is in
No,
the house.
that's from an older one.
Old one, sorry, I'm still getting my Nick Cave years together. But the whole song is, God is here, God is there, God is in the house. And you're kind of deceived a little bit in thinking like, oh yeah, we have to go to these places because that's where God lives and that's where God is. And at the end of the song, he changes the lyric to, I wish he would come out. And it just gives you just like this huge blow because you really don't expect it to go there. And I think that's kind of what we're talking about, all of this insiderness. And we just wish it would all be kind of let out because, as you always say in the lecture that I've said so many times, away from the center, which is kind of where I was going to go with my next question. You published so much. You published a book, I believe, called The Idolatry of God. And in the last several years of your career, especially, you've addressed this idea of the illusion or the delusion of certainty. And I think that has a major role to play in any conversation of future and faith, because that is why so many people are going out or leaving or really saying, if faith is this or this, then I'm going to choose this because certainty is not, I guess, where it's at anymore. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and so I used doubts and ambiguity as a good starting point for kind of getting people to start questioning and start thinking. But then the radical move for me is, where my later work goes, is the idea that the church is the radical outside. Sadly, God has often been used as a justification of the status quo. So and religion is often used to justify our way of life, our military, our football team. Okay? I mean, it's obviously funny when you say it like that. But crazily, God has traditionally been used in philosophy called the guarantor, which is the guarantor of your way of constructing life in the world. And actually, I'm more drawn by this notion. John Caputo says that God is not a projection. Is not a projection of our ideals. God is a projectile. God is that which actually ruptures our notions of how the world works. And that actually the church should be a place where we are able to be continually freed from our frenetic commitment to the world we live in, and to structures that cause anxiety, cause violence, cause scapegoating. That the church is this radical, Paul calls Christian trash of the world, or in some, what Luther says, the shit of the world, and so the outside, the trash that you put on the outside, and that somehow that's where the action is. God is always on the outside. And so that's where my work is always been pushing towards, creating radically alternative communities that help us free ourselves from structures that are oppressive to the winners and the losers. In our society, the losers lose doubly, but even the winners lose. Right? That's incredible to have a system where even the winners lose and the losers lose even worse. So, how do we just get out of that?
And again, you've spoken a lot on this idea of kind of the hope of the center and the promise of the center, and really kind of the tyranny of the center. That we're promised something, and it's a false promise because it's a promise that can never really be made good on. But we live in kind of the false hope of that. I mean, what kind of effect do you think that has on the changing religious landscape?
This is core because for me, the fantasy that there is something that will make us whole is not strict, narrowly religious. You find it, it's part of being human. I always can't get into it. But so without choking the answer, is that to be human is to experience certain separation, certain lack. I am not you, you're not me. I am not the people in this room. And that there's certain kind of lack to that. And people promise that they can fill the lack in all sorts of ways. But for me, forgiveness is just a religious way of saying sin is a lack. And to pay a lack is to pay a debt, is to fill it. But to forgive a debt is to say the lack that you feel is nothing. The nothingness, I'm not going to pay the debt, I'm going to forgive. Which what that means, I become free from one sense of separation, not because it's filled by a new car, by a religious deity, by fasting, by prayer, by a person, but because I've learned to realize that lack is not something to do with doubt. That's why I love unravel. Right? To unravel, as you know, is to be pulled apart. And it sounds negative. I'm unraveling. It's a nightmare. I'm unraveling, which is how it always feels when you start to question yourself. And my work is about saying, not that you can it's something new, but rather realize that you're actually raveling. And to ravel means it's not the same as you know as to unravel. So to ravel means also to be pulled apart, but it doesn't have the negative on. You're not unraveling, you're raveling. It's wonderful.
And those things are happening at the same time.
Yeah. It's like that's that doubt, complexity, and ambiguity. It's where the life is.
Yeah.
You know, it's where the passion.
Yeah. And so in a sense, this idea of the center and the sphere of unraveling or raveling kind of keeps us sort of imprisoned again to that kind of false hope of the center and completion and satisfaction and all sorts of a whole list of goods that were kind of falsely sold. But you're kind of saying once we let go of that and cancel that out and realize that that's sort of an illusion, that is sort of where the freedom lies. And that is where, and one thing I've always really appreciated about your work is that you are about deconstruction, but not for the sake of just kind of separating and sort of walking away. It's like, and again, I don't want to kind of falsely say something you're not, because I don't want to say either that you deconstruct just to construct, because that's another false promise.
Yes,
then it's just another center. But you deconstruct in a way that say, okay, let's live here for a bit, and not only for a bit, but maybe forever. And like, how do we find beauty in living with the deconstruction with no promise of reconstruction?
And that's what the mystics were so good at.
Yeah.
Like one of the things, and mystics, I think mystics, in a sense, it's difficult to be a mystic today. I think it's outdated in the terms of where the epoch is. But the mystics have incredible insight. The mystics took doubt, and instead of either filling it, making certain or whatever, they enjoyed it. It's clever. So they turned the deconstruction into something enjoyable and into something wonderful. So as you say, the question for me is not taking deconstruction and then reconstructing. It's doing what the mystics did, which was envelop the antagonism into the institution and enjoy it. So they actually, the mystics taught us how to actually have joy and pleasure out of kind of not having direct access to the real.
It's also a little bit, I think, that it also, the process of deconstruction kind of brings everything to the surface, and it does away with inside and outside, in the sense that what happens, I think, is you wind up with your full humanity exposed rather than concealed. And I think where a lot of anxiety and stress happens for people is in the kind of encasing of bits and pieces of their life. And I think that happens a lot in religion, because we build these kind of edifices in which and through which we live. But a lot of it involves, in some ways, not honoring or owning things like doubt. You know, it's like, I mean, it should be, we're talking about the immaterial. It should be a no-brainer that doubt is a component of human existence, but somehow it's been made to be a troublesome thing in a certain way. And I think to be laid bare, to have all of those things on the surface, to be to have everything on the surface and up front in your life, the whole of who you are, that's where you start to find freedom in existence. Am I making sense? I'm not sure if I get my point out.
This for me is like the positive nature of prayer. So the negative nature of prayer for me is like, I pray for the kids in Somalia, and I pray that, all of this. In other words, it's your ideal self. I want to be the type of person who cares for kids in Somalia. So the prayer is a reflection of your ideal self. But within the Lutheran tradition, there's confessional prayer, which is where prayer is the attempt to articulate the inner moods and grooves of your being, the truth coming out, confessing the truth. where you say, I don't care about the kids in Somalia. I don't care about this. You know, I'm a bit of an asshole sometimes. And speaking that out. And the idea in confessional prayer is when you do that, it is fundamentally transformative. So these are the rituals that I think are really useful. It's like, you know, the example of a love letter. You write a love letter to somebody else, but you often don't send it because it's for yourself. It's your way of speaking your inner truth on the paper, and then you throw it away because the love letter was for you, not for the other person. So yeah, these are where, like what Barry's saying, is where you're able to start to bring that stuff that you repress to the light of day, and that is in itself transformative. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free.
So essentially, we're all about leadership, and essentially what we're asking people to do is innovate their current theological frameworks. And I think your work really challenges most people's traditional theological norms, which I think is so good and so needed. But one thing that anybody doing this work knows is that when you have these conversations, there is some fear and there is some anxiety and there is this, am I going to lose my identity, my story, my narrative, everything I can keep my entire life in? Because we're not talking about a vocational choice, we're not even talking about a relationship, we're talking about someone's bedrock identity. And these ideas challenge that in really kind of deep and very profound ways. So just to kind of finish this conversation, what is something you would say to sort of give people hope or invite them to this journey, I suppose?
I mean, one of the key points for me is to find a way to enjoy this horror.
There you go, enjoy the horror.
Enjoy the horror, and that's kind of it. Is we tried to develop these decentric practices. One of them was called the Last Supper, where we have a meal, 12 of us. We invite someone who likely has a very different perspective on sexuality or religion or whatever, politics. We put them in the seat of Christ. We listen to what they have to say, and if we don't like it, it's their Last Supper, right? We poison the last glass of wine. And it's kind of a fun night. And we have a laugh, we drink together, we listen. And it's decentering because we're hearing over maybe a year, 12 different people who challenge us. But it's done in a way that's not fearful, not terrifying. It's done in a way that we're eating together, we're talking together, we're laughing together. When it's defensive, or defenses go off, you say to me, "You were terrible to your mom." I'd be like, "No, I'm not. She's a nightmare. You don't know her. She's mustard, right?" And then, but if you then invite me out for a coffee and chat with me instead, and then say, "Pete, you seem deeply like stressed at the moment. Are you okay?" I'll be like, "Yeah, they really took it out of my mom," right? As soon as you directly get at me, my defense is going, even though I know you're telling the truth about me being an idiot to my mom, my defenses won't let me admit it. But indirectly, you find a way to help me enjoy talking about it. Oh, yeah, I'm glad I'm getting this off my chest. So how do we develop ways in which we're not frightened of the genuine horror of deconstructing our lives, but somehow we're like, no, you know what? It's going to be fun. My goodness, what am I going to do? Sit and watch Netflix? I don't know. I want to do this. I want to deconstruct everything. I want to take everything apart. That sounds like living.
Maybe real quick, you use the illustration of being evangelized.
Yeah.
Like in a lot of ways, for a spiritual entrepreneur, one of the greatest gifts is not to tell somebody this is what you do. It really is asking the questions, the vulnerability of being able to learn and grow and change. Maybe you could play with that a little bit, like so people who are in ministry or thinking about ministry or think I could never be a minister because they do it that way. There's a sense of doing this even with different technologies, yes, different ways, different approaches. Maybe as you play with the evangelism idea.
Yeah, we have a decentering practice called the Evangelism Project, where we go to be evangelized by other communities. By the way, this is very popular with conservative Christians, right? We had a lot of conservative Christians who did this. We would go to, say, the Islamic Society, and we would ask them what did they believe. Now, the evangelism didn't happen then because most religions aren't trying to really evangelize you that much. Christianity is an exception, right? But so they would tell you about Islam, and then the evangelism happened next. We would say, what does it look like to be a Muslim in Belfast? What do we look like to you? And then you would see yourself through the other's eyes, and you would see things that you maybe didn't like. and you would then be evangelized to become a more human person, to become more Christian in your own tradition. So the evangelism project, as you said, was exactly this, opening up to realizing the other is far further conversion. And I actually work with a missionary organization, teaching these young people that you think you're going to this country to evangelize, but you will find out that you'll do nothing but damage in 2 weeks. You know, you're 17 years old, you don't know anything, you're going to be a disaster. But if you're open to it, you might come away from that experience a different person. You might realize that that's one of the most life-transforming events you've ever had, that you're actually being evangelized. And by the way, this is how I want to think about doing social action. People often think that if you go to a prison, for example, you're good news to the prisoners, or I'm working with the homeless, I'm good news to the homeless. No, the prisoners and the homeless are good news to you, because society has problems, and then we create like the manifestation of the problems. The symptom is prisons, prison population, violence in the police force, violence in the judicial system. And so what happens when we meet prisoners? We see the violence and the problems within our own society. We witness firsthand the problems that we are part of, and we are called to be evangelized. They are good news. The reason why we should do good works is not because we're doing something good to the other, that we are somehow God to them. It's because that is where we will encounter God. That is where we will be evangelized. That is where we will be transformed. What a wonderful way to spend a life.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation. And again, thank you for all the work that you do to move these things forward. And thank you all for watching. And you will get the link for tomorrow's conversation with Sue Phillips from Unbean and the incubator out of Harvard. So we will see you then. Thank you so much.
All right, that's us.
Great,
okay,
great.
Thank you. Well,
Absolutely.
Oh, yes, that's right. There we go. Yes. You want to choose yes.
Sorry.
all right.